Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Angela Brooker, Occupational Health Manager at Multiplex. We often talk about indoor air quality in buildings, but almost exclusively in operation. There is a whole class of occupiers of spaces that work almost exclusively outside of the operational phase of the building, and those are construction and demolition workers. Angela is at the tip of the spear in protecting the worker in construction, and in this particular case, exposure to dust and respiratory illnesses. If you listen to the last week's episode with the WHO, you will have some sense of just how important this work is. We had a truly fascinating discussion, breaking apart just what these risks are, how they are perceived and managed with one of the most forward-thinking organisations in the UK. It is remarkable quite how layered, dynamic and complex managing dust risk is in a construction environment, how much is being done by responsible organisations and how far even they have to go. So many of us work in and around construction. This is an episode everyone needs to stop and take some time to listen to. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Angela Brooker. In Air Quality Matters, a lot of focus is on indoor air quality and the impact of our built environment on our long-term health and well-being. And almost exclusively, that conversation has been around the impacts of occupants and users of spaces. But what we really mean there is the operational phase of a building. And there's a whole other sector of society that operates, certainly in their working life anyway, almost exclusively outside of that operational phase of a building. And that's construction workers in construction and demolition of these buildings that we live in, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's for Multiplex, we have about 10 different projects in central London, and they're a mix of residential and commercial with thousands of operatives, construction operatives that come in every day and are building these buildings for us. As you know, there are lots of hazards in construction. And one of the most common ones that we come across is dust. When it comes to air quality, that is a potential real issue for our operatives in terms of their health.
Yeah, and I think people will have a sense of the risk of dust with construction. Anybody that's either lived in and around particularly big building sites will see measures being put into place, for example, like water being used to keep dust down on roads, and the monitoring may be going on at an environmental level. So I think people have this recognition that there's a certain level of dust that happens around sites. So there's that kind of ambient issue, but there's also very much, this is works going on in a building where we're maybe tearing down and demolishing existing structures for refurbishment and change of use. We're constructing stuff from the ground up. We've got a massive array of trades doing all sorts of things that generate all sorts of pollutants, dust being the primary one.
Absolutely. We tend to put dust into three different categories. So wood dust, general dust, if you like. So that's dust with a low silica content, if you like. So things like plasterboard or gypsum. And then you've got your silica dust, and that's in concrete, sandstone, granite, artificial stone or engineered stone, which is used typically for kitchen worktops. So pretty much everything that we use and all the materials that we use in construction have an element of dust in, and that's fine if their products are just sitting there and not doing anything and not being changed or altered. But when you cut, you drill, you release these, very fine dust particles, particularly when it comes to silica dust, into the environment. And it's then that potentially the dangers can happen for the operatives that are doing these tasks. And yeah, like you say, it's a a wide range of roles that do create dust on site. I mean, carpenters, for example, with the wood dust. You've got stonemasons, concrete finishers, all of that. So it's very common. We're never going to get rid of the dust on site. We can't eliminate it completely, but it's how I guess we are encouraging people to control it. That is going to reduce the risks of their exposure.
I mean, anybody that's been around construction usually plays that game on the tube of wondering what trade that person sat opposite them does based on what they're covered in, right? That's just the nature of construction. And I think the interesting thing about construction as well is it's a really complex environment. Not only have you got very different spaces, as you said, you've got people working outside, maybe on paving and curbways and things like that. You've got people working on the outside of buildings or in the buildings in the very early phases that are weathered at some point. And you've got all the way through to almost finished environments, completely closed in spaces. So from a risk perspective, it's a very, very dynamic because normally when we talk about air quality is complicated enough because humans are dynamic, it's a changing environment. But in construction, a building is literally changing its nature by the day, isn't it? So those risks will morph and change depending on where a building is in its phase.
Depending on what's going on, and also in regards to what materials they're using as well. If we're talking about silica dust, granite has different levels of silica in it compared to engineered stone or artificial stone, which can have up to 90% silica in. So, the products are very different. The spaces are very different that they're working in. It could be a very small space. It could be outside, like you say. And there could be different people around. So say if one person's doing a task that's creating a lot of dust, there could be other trades around doing other jobs that, potentially that exposure could go on to them as well. So it's about just making sure that the operatives looking after themselves, but also the people that are working around them, potentially not working for their company, but are in their environment as well.
Yeah, and that made me think, I mean, not only do you have the dynamics of the phases of construction and the different types of spaces that people might be working in, but you've also got a very dynamic nature of the level of activity in a space. Clearly there are going to be very high peaks of dust and pollutants as activities are happening. And I imagine they could be compounded. You're not just dealing with wood dust, you might be dealing with a combination of 2 or 3 problem dusts at any one time. You know what sites are like. They can be very busy places. But then there's also that kind of ambient background level. It's the just because an activity has stopped doesn't mean that risk doesn't hang around over quite a long period of time, depending on the space, and what fate. If you're working on a roof, cutting concrete tiles, I imagine that dissipates fairly rapidly. But if you're working in a building, in a room, and somebody's sawing through skirting boards and creating a lot of dust, that dust could be in the air for hours and hours, depending on how long people are going to be around. Because also a lot of the protection mechanisms that we would have in an operational phase of a building may not be operational at that time, or may deliberately not be turned on at that point to stop degradation of the system. So they can be pretty poorly ventilated spaces as well at times.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a program of works, and like you say, people will do a task, create dust, hopefully clear it up, but the housekeeping element is huge as well, because in my experience of walking around projects, and it's not just our sites at all, this is across construction, how are they clearing up that dust after they finish the task, or are they leaving it and therefore it's hanging in the air, or it gets walked and kicked up again into the environment. So yeah, there is certainly an element of, it's not just the task and then it's finished, that whatever they've done, whatever materials they're using, there will still be an element of, like you say, of it being in the air, being in the environment, and then someone else may come along and automatically go into that environment to do their job that they're doing. So, people move everywhere on a site. They're not just in one fixed position. They've got different parts of the building to go to and to do tasks in. So it's very much, we've got to think of everybody, not just the people that are, doing the high risk tasks when it comes to dust, but we've got to think of everybody in that environment as well, that's walking through that environment.
Yeah, and you just mentioned kind of resuspension, which of course is the kind of the legacy of that activity, that even after everything has settled, you may go in there the day after to start your work. And by the nature of some trades, you're very close to surfaces and things with what you're doing. So you can be very close to that resuspension. It's not like you're just, yes, there's the kind of kicking it up off the floor, where it might not have been cleaned up, but you've also got the fact that your activities may resuspend previous dust, and you may be very close to that dust as well. It sounds like an absolute minefield. Like when you actually kind of pick it apart and realize, quite what a risk this is. And, people that listen to this show and people that have an interest in air quality, I think will recognize how serious an issue this is. But perhaps we haven't thought about quite how complex and interesting, frankly, construction is from an exposure perspective. I mean, it's incredibly complex.
It is. It can be difficult to manage. I mean, our contractors do a very good job most of the time to try and control these hazards, but it's not an easy thing to do because, as we said before, all of the materials that we use and the tasks that we do create dust. So it's how we try and manage those and on a daily basis, and also getting that message out every single day and reiterating that message all the time to our contractors and to our operatives that are doing the work is so important, because it's a message that can get lost, very, very easily, because they've got a program to stick to, they've got work to do, and there's a lot of pressure to do that. So health is something that tends to unfortunately become a little bit invisible when we're talking about construction as a whole. And it's just about really driving through that message that, unfortunately, people's exposure to these substances can cause ill health and can kill people. And so it's just very important to drive that through all the time.
Now, I often use construction as an example of a industry that has shown very good ability to adopt health and safety practices over time, for a number of reasons, but one, because it's so serious, but also because it's quite a hierarchical structure and a problem solving orientated environment. There's not a lot of politicking and lobbying and obfuscation that goes on site. A problem is presented and you figure out how to sort it out. You don't have time to be messing around arguing points eternally like we might be able to do in academia or something, right? So we look at things like scaffolding safety, PPE, heavy machinery, working at heights, all of these things. Construction has shown an unbelievable ability to really clean up its act, and I think if you were to have gone on a site 25, 30 years ago and were to go onto a major site now, you just would not recognize them, between even just the security of getting on and the requirements of safety training to even be set a foot in the space. It's just completely changed, right? But many of those risks we're talking about in construction are very immediate and, significant risks. Electrocution, getting crushed by a tipper, falling off a scaffolding, having to wear a hard hat, these kind of things are pretty obvious. And I think anybody at any age recognizes that, yeah, okay, fair enough, falling off that scaffolding is not going to be good for my health. Are there examples in construction of health related or safety related things that impact long-term health that construction has done well, do you think? Asbestos, I suppose, is one of them. They copped onto that, didn't they?
Absolutely. They did. I think the general nature of a lot of these these illnesses, when we're talking about dust specifically, are latent. So from the time of exposure through to the development of symptoms or being diagnosed, it can be years, just like with asbestos. So silicosis, for example, which you can get from exposure to silica dust chronically or with a large exposure, it can take 10 to 30 years to develop. So if you think about an operative coming to work on a Monday morning, all that's in their mind is, right, what have I got to do today? What potentially could hurt me? What do I need to put in place to stop that happening so that I can go home tonight and I'm safe, but I've earned the money that I need to earn? So trying to encourage people to think about the next 10, 30 years can be a lot more difficult than thinking about, okay, what can hurt me today? If you're talking about, I mean, like you say, asbestos is very much in the forefront of people's minds, and it's been a long time that that's been banned, but people have still coming through with asbestosis and lung cancer and things like that. But it's just a very different mindset, I guess, you could say, for our operatives to think in. And that's why I say we just have to keep reiterating the message. I often compare it to trying to get someone to stop smoking or trying to encourage someone to stop smoking. It's something that's not happening today. It's not happening in the here and now. It's something that could potentially happen in the future. But have we got the time or the mental space to think about that right now?
Yeah, and the excuses are the same as well. Well, my dad's done this business for 40 years. He's fine. He never wore a mask. So the same stuff you heard with smoking. It's that you can always point to somebody that got away with it, and there'll always be people that get away with it, of course.
Of course there will.
I think the interesting thing with construction, it's a challenge all the way up the management ladder as well. On a site, nobody wants to be the site manager who has an operative that's crushed or falls off a scaffold or electrocutes themselves, right? That's not a good place to be. And the result of that is that you get shouted at if you're on site and you haven't got your high vis on. You get, people go round and check that scaffolding is safe, that, people are, very aware of heavy machinery moving around on site. You just don't want to be that person. You don't want to be the person causing the injury. You don't want to be the person receiving it. And you certainly don't want to be the person responsible for those people or those trades, so I think there's that fear built in, and people get it, and it's enforced. The challenge with these kind of longer term occupational risks is you're not going to be around when that operative suffers the injury. Well, they're suffering the injury every moment that they're breathing that air in, but you're not going to be around when the symptoms are there. And that's a different game, isn't it? Because you're people, like when you get bollocked on site for not doing the right thing, you don't really have an argument. It's fair enough, mate. Yeah, sorry, But I imagine for something like dust control, and we will come on to like what you do about it, but I imagine for dust control, you nearly need to be permanently going around reminding people, and you're just going to be seen as a pain in the arse. Like there isn't that same connection that you get with not wearing your hard hat when you're on a scaffold, right? It makes it harder, I guess.
Like you say, you do have to keep reminding people, but it's shouting about health as much as we shout about safety. And you're right, a lot of these people, if we're thinking about a 10 to 30 year time period, they'll have retired, the building will have been built, and that's that. And when they start to develop symptoms, where's the connection between what they did as a job role? There's some cases, I'm sure, that, for example, if we're talking about smoking and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, that's known as a smoker's disease, but you can develop that through your exposure to silica dust, for example. So if you are a lifelong smoker and you go to your GP when you're in your 70s with shortness of breath, a kind of a phlegmy cough, then the GP will ask the question, you're a smoker, or are you a smoker? Well, yes. Okay. Well, there's the cause, not what did you do for a job role? So there's that also kind of disconnect. And I know there's a lot of work going on to encourage, medical professionals to ask about occupational history, particularly when it comes to construction work, because it means that things are less likely to be misdiagnosed as something else, but also that they're going to get the right treatment. And if they are still working in construction, potentially there's a conversation that needs to be had about, do we stop working in construction? Do we stop that exposure if possible? That would be the ideal scenario.
Is there liability for employers here? Because if you fall off a scaffolding, right, or get crushed on site, like, the liability is direct. Like, somebody was responsible for you getting run over, or whatever it is. So that liability is very profound and impactful, and probably one of the reasons why it's so heavily enforced. But if an operative is, really starting to experience the injury 20, 30 years down the road, unless they were a lifelong employee of one construction firm or something, I imagine which is rare, yeah, very much so in construction, even just because construction firms often don't hang around for, die out relatively quickly, right? So, I mean, I know you guys take it seriously, hence we're talking to you, but is that perhaps one of the challenges here, is that you're trying to enforce something where there isn't really accountability for it in a liability sense, or is there? I mean, are there? Can you get in trouble effectively as an employer at this stage for not enforcing this stuff?
I think it's early days, if I'm honest with you. I don't know masses about it, but I know that there are people that are challenging and seeking compensation for it. But I don't, I think it's still very early days. I'm not sure if there's been a kind of successful case yet that's been brought, but not sure on that, to be honest with you. But I mean, we're doing it because for us, nobody should have to come to work and develop an illness or a disease. I mean, we are well beyond that. We're in 2026, and regardless of whether they get it when they retire or it develops when they retire, it's really something that all these illnesses can be prevented. So, we really need to make sure that it doesn't happen to people. And I think that's it for us, to be honest.
Yeah. And there's a human element to this as well. Construction workers have a tough enough time as it is. It's a physical job. There often isn't the safety nets that there are in other industries from the point of retirement and welfare and so on. Their ability to work through their entire work life can be very difficult depending on the trade that you're doing. It's tough enough out there without acquiring injuries through no fault of your own, just doing your job. I mean, that's like you say, it's unnecessary and unfair. And I think there's a fairness thing here. Like you say, you shouldn't be turning up to work and storing up chronic respiratory diseases for when you're older. And I'd encourage people, we won't go into it too heavily here, but I'd encourage people to listen to the episode with the WHO we did recently, where we talk about what that looks like, and what chronic respiratory disease looks like for people is awful. It's awful on so many levels, that we don't want that for anybody.
No, absolutely. And it shouldn't happen. We've got like I said at the beginning, we can't get rid of dust. We can't eliminate it. And we can, plan out some of it. We can substitute things like artificial stone. We can substitute it with other products. We've got lots of kind of engineering controls that we can put in place, and administrative controls, and education and awareness, and RPE and things like that. But ultimately, this shouldn't be happening now, because we've got all these things that we can do. We just shouldn't have people developing COPD or silicosis or TB because of their exposure to silica dust, or nasal cancer because of their exposure to wood dust. It's just not something that is acceptable, really. in this day and age.
This isn't going to be an all doom and gloom conversation. We'll come on to the solutions, I promise. But I think it's really worth laying out, quite the challenges we have here. A lot of what you've been saying actually reminds me of a conversation I had with the fire service, actually through the same contracts, Ultra Protect, who introduced us. A couple of the people they're working with work with the fire service. And there was a conversation I had with them that I think is interesting here as well, is also there's a cultural issue here to deal with, and there is a certain bravado, I would say, about, or certainly historically there was, of pride coming out of an activity absolutely covered in whatever it was you were doing, right? And they have that in the fire service. There's this image of a fireman, usually pretty muscly and looking a lot better than I do, but with their face covered in soot, having saved somebody, right? That's the kind of the trope of the fire service. But in actual fact, the correct trope should be that same image, but with a perfectly pristine, clean face, because they were wearing the proper PPE to be doing their job. There should be no dirt around the face and nose whatsoever if they're correctly managing the risk, right? But that's the image. And I know it's not the same in construction, but in a way it is. I think back to my early days in construction where, the tape and jointers would come out of a space absolutely head to toe, look like they'd been frosted and delighted with themselves to some level. And they might have been wearing some crappy paper mask, but like generally speaking, everything was absolutely, they'd pat themselves and there'd be a big cloud of smoke, or joiners doing certain activities and being absolutely covered in it. There is a bit of that still, I'm guessing, in construction where look, I'm doing a job, but if I'm doing it properly, I get covered, like it is what it is, and you've got to fight against that. That actually what we want to see, the good result, is you coming out, yes, covered in dust, but wearing the appropriate overalls for it, and with a completely clean face is what we want to see.
Yeah,
right.
Want to see.
Yeah,
and I think, like you say, it has changed a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they I don't think they ignore the risks as such. I think it's they know it in the back of their mind that they are there. And a lot of the times I'll go out on site and we do these walks called health intervention tours. So we focus on, we'll walk out onto a site, for example, and with the health and safety team, I do these, and we will focus on the hazards that we see. So we will give positive kind of interventions, if you like. So we will give positive feedback if they're doing the right things, which we do see. It's not unusual to see people doing all the right things that we want and to employ the control measures that they need for that particular task. But then we will also kind of do room for improvement, or negative, although we don't really like that word, interventions as well. And that will be, you're maybe not doing the right thing, or you're nearly doing the right thing, but what's the reason behind why you've decided to do this? And the answer we always get is, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. And my kind of comeback to that is, look, this isn't me. This isn't my lungs. This isn't my health. This is you. This is not us walking around having a go at you for not doing something or doing something you shouldn't. It is literally to say to you, please think about your health. Please think about the future that is coming. And do you need anything from us to help support you doing this? Is this, a reason that you didn't have any RPE in stores today, or your on-tool extraction is broken, or whatever it may be? Then we can try and support them with that. So you do get different answers, but thinking about generations, I mean, a couple of years ago, I was walking around a site and I got talking to a couple of lads who were in their early 20s, and, I can't remember, I think they were electricians. And I said to one of them, look, just, make sure you're drilling into the ceiling, that this is concrete. You need to be, having appropriate RPE if you haven't got on-tool extraction, and, probably need it anyway. And he said, I'm only here for a couple of weeks. Like, this is just a, part-time job. I'm just like, it's not going to be here. It's not going to happen. Anyway, then I rounded the corner and got talking to a guy in his around his 50s. And he said, oh, I was only going to be here for a couple of weeks, but actually I'm still here, doing this job. And I just thought, wow, that's happened within kind of 10 minutes of each other. And it just shows the kind of thought process. They think, oh, it's just, it's a quick job. It's a quick drill. I'm in a rush. I need to get things done. I'm only here for a couple of weeks. I don't need to worry about that. And then life happens and people end up staying in that trade. And I would like to think that the kind of older generations, if you like, in construction are teaching the younger generation to do the right thing from that point. Don't leave it until you hear about your mate who's got silicosis or COPD because they've been exposed and didn't take the right control measures.
Yeah.
Take that action now so that you will retire healthy and happy and work until you want.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There is an invincibility element, particularly to the younger generation, isn't there? That we all hark back to in our early 20s and late teens, where you could go out drinking and get up the next day and work. You shake off illnesses in 24 hours. Like you just not a lot troubles you when you're that age, and it's very difficult to project how I feel in the morning when I have to think about standing up on the side of the bed every morning for 30 seconds, prepare myself. So it's a hard one to do that long-term projection. So I'd be really interested to kind of get a picture of what that kind of health and safety routine looks like when we're talking about dust on construction. You were talking about walkarounds then, and you were also talking about at the very beginning kind of three areas that you focus on: kind of wood dust, silica dust, and general construction dust. What does that practically look like for people that are, if you were never seen this before and you were coming to do a site tour of a construction site? What is occupational health and safety with dust these days? I mean,
for myself, like I say, when I first started in this role in 2021, me and the Director of Health and Safety, who's my manager as such, kind of sat down and planned out with one of the doctors that we work with, one of the occupational health doctors that we work with, how we could kind of make a difference in terms of being visible on site and highlighting these hazards and risks to the workforce, and just to encourage kind of what should be done, if you like. So we came up with these HITs, these health intervention tours, and people do site inspections and check-ins and things like that, but this is slightly different because the focus is purely health. So how that would look, the health and safety team are very heavily involved with the HITs. I visit each site once a month and do a HIT with the health and safety manager. And it involves us literally just walking out on site and talking to people. And we may see a particular task going on, and it could be any kind of hazard that we pick up on. It could be noise, it could be musculoskeletal risk, it could be fatigue even. And what we found, because obviously we collect this data, so we collect the data in terms of our positive interventions and our negative interventions. We keep numbers on them, and it helps us because obviously, like we were saying at the beginning, depending on the stage of the project, you're potentially going to get more hazards, or you're going to get more positive interventions at that time. It just really depends on the trade that's on site and what is happening. But that data kind of, we looked at it, and we kind of were seeing that our dust interventions were a lot higher. And that could be positive and negative. It was just the general number was a lot higher that we were intervening. And I think that's just a reflection that dust is common, and the jobs that we do in construction, it creates dust. That's as simple as that. And that's across the construction industry in total. Looking at that data, and I was sitting on it and thinking, we really need to do something about this, because this, we don't want people becoming unwell. We want to reduce the risk to these operatives of the exposure of dust. So, and we really honed in on silica dust. So for us, that was, coming up time and time again. So we kind of put together a bit of a silica, well, we call it Silica 25, but it's a continuous thing. It wasn't just for 1 year, a bit of a program. And there's 3 elements to that program. So there is prevention. And when we talk about prevention, we're talking mainly about artificial stone or engineered stone. So our aim was to ban artificial stone on all our upcoming projects, which we have been able to do with the help of Dr. Joanna Feary, who's a respiratory consultant at the Royal Brompton Hospital. She wrote a paper about her clinical practice in her work to do with artificial stone silicosis. So with her help, we managed to ban that. The second arm of it is protection. So with protection, we're mainly looking at RPE, making sure that our operatives have suitable and appropriate RPE, but also that there is the education and awareness around the dust that they are exposed to. They understand what it can do to them. They understand how to use RPE and what to use in that particular task. And then the third one is detection and monitoring. So that is to do with health surveillance, the routine health checks, and just, helping support our contractors to ensure that people are getting health surveillance and they're getting the appropriate health surveillance if needed. So those are the kind of 3 aims, if you like, that we're focusing on. Of course, our ban in artificial stone kind of came in late last year, but that doesn't mean the program's over. We certainly are keeping going with what we can do to reduce that risk. So lots of kind of things in the pipeline potentially. And I guess it's really about supporting our contractors. It's not, we talk to them quite frequently about the issues that they face and the struggles that they face with various things, and we want to try and help them, support them. So it's not us kind of barking at them or demanding things. It's saying, well, okay, well, this is what we want as a standard. Is this possible? And how can we help you to achieve that?
I'm going to deviate from the conversation ever so slightly because I think it's important to touch on it, but I do want to come back to this kind of what that looks like, because I think there's several areas here, particularly the kind of the RPE and the elimination of certain materials. So I'll come back to that. But I do just want to jump onto silica very quickly and artificial stone, because I think unless you've been aware of this conversation and dialogue that's been happening around silica, particularly in the last couple of years, you might not be aware, because it seems like why ban an artificial stone, right? So perhaps let's just give a little bit of a backstory about what's been coming to light when it comes to workers involved with artificial stone, which, as you said at the beginning, if people didn't pick it up, can be up to like 90% silica. So concrete and other stones may have some silica in them, but at a much lower level. These artificial products can be very, very high indeed. But we've seen some horrifying, frankly, occupational risk coming to light. I think Australia was a real hotbed for it, and maybe let's just talk through that. What is silica and what's been happening, particularly with artificial products made of it?
Artificial stone or engineered stone. Australia kind of defined it, and this is the definition that we're running with. So it's a product that is typically used for kitchen worktops, got a nice aesthetic, easy to work with. But the kind of definition is 3 things. So it contains up to 90% silica, but they kind of define it as a product that contains over 1% of silica, that contains resins, pigments, and becomes hardened. And that's the 3 things that make up the definition of an engineered stone or an artificial stone, or people call it quartz as well. So that's the product. And it can contain up to 90% silica, which is a huge amount. But also you've got potentially the resins and pigments. We're not sure what those substances can do to people's health as well. But this product, when it is put together for kitchen worktops, so cut, adjusted, drilled, you've got the kind of holes for your sinks and things like that. I've been reliably informed, there are places around London workshops that have no control measures in place whatsoever when people are, manufacturing or putting together these products, and it is causing an accelerated silicosis or an artificial stone silicosis that is coming on in 5 years. And it is, I believe there is a case that came on after a few months exposure. It's been banned in Australia. I think it was banned in 2024. Now, they, I think, found about 1,000 cases in the end because they did a very proactive public health campaign and kind of searched for it, if you like.
When looking for the silence. Yeah.
Yes. And I think they were about 1,000 cases. I'm not sure what they are now, but hopefully a lot less, given that they've banned it. And they've banned imports of it as well. But it's generally manufactured in the US, Spain, Israel, China, and then it will come over and be cut. And obviously, there are some factories that cut it or warehouses that cut it that are very good, and they do maintain fantastic control measures and continuous water suppression and things like that. But there are some that don't, obviously, because these cases are appearing, and they're appearing globally. And Dr. Joanna Feary, who I mentioned before, I think at the minute she may correct me if I'm wrong, but she's got about 40 cases in her clinic in London. And I believe all of them have used or worked with artificial stone in this country. So it is an illness that is not curable. You cannot reverse it. And really, there's no treatment. It's about supportive care for that individual. So it's coming on very quickly, and it is unfortunately killing people. And like we say, we just thought we don't want to be part of this on any level. So therefore, we have banned it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's a responsibility element to this, that you don't want to support as a supply chain that is working with such a risky material. And I hadn't thought of that, actually. I mean, there's the silicosis side of it, but as you say, this stuff is absolutely made of resins. And if we've learned anything from timber materials and formaldehyde and these kind of stuff, where you basically glue shit together, that stuff's made of normally not very pleasant things. So there's a risk not just in the material itself, but in the products used to stitch it together. But I think the other part of this, which is interesting, which I've spoken to people about, is it's dangerous to assume the risk stops in manufacturing. That when you actually think about what happens, like with a kitchen worktop as an example, tap holes might not be drilled until it hits site. There's finishing and routing and smoothing off of edges and putting stuff together and getting it to finally fit, because nothing's perfect on site. You can measure and have a worktop brought in, but there's usually a little bit of messing around to get it right. And then there's the polishing, that often the finish needs tidying up, or levels need to be brought together, and there's always. So there's actually whatever about the risk upstream of the production of the product, there's a risk actually on site in your environment as well with this product, isn't there?
It's something that, obviously we've banned it on all our upcoming projects. So at the minute, I think there's one or two that it's completely banned on. But, we have all our ongoing projects that still potentially have that in place. And like you say, adjustments walls aren't right, or they didn't match up to the drawings, or whatever it may be. So for us, it's just making sure that if an adjustment is needed on an artificial stone product, that we are speaking to the contractor, seeing what control measures they've got in place, and just making sure they're the best that they could be, really.
It shows the threat level if a material is actually being, because this is a sought after finish.
Yeah, absolutely. It's cheap as well, isn't it? It's cheaper. So
there's a resistance and a pressure with clients and people like that want those kind of finishes, where you as a deployer of that finish are saying, no, that there are some hard lines we have. It's interesting, isn't it, with the material, that something might get to a risk level where you say, look, there's got a bit, we need another way of doing this. And that's a really good example within the middle tier. You're not the manufacturer, you're not the ultimate customer, but you see a risk in the deployment of a particular process or material, and you go, no, that there's some potentially hard lines here.
Yeah, and there's alternatives, and I don't think it was an easy thing for the business to do, and I'm really proud to actually work for a business that has taken that stance. I don't know about whether it will be banned in the UK. I mean, I'm not experienced enough or in the right circles to know that, but I think if we do it, then potentially other people are gonna, other contractors may think actually maybe we should ban it as well. And I don't think we were the first by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just kind of, it's good that we're leading by example, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and the supply chain figures that out pretty quickly. When they see people making moves like that, you look very poor if you're not doing the same. It's a really good differentiator. But you can imagine there'll be elements of the sector that might be under enormous pressure to deploy that kind of system or product that might feel it's just a push too far. Basically, what are the alternatives? Is it working with granite and marble, like the actual natural stone is your only other choice?
Yeah, there's a product called Corian. I mean, obviously stainless steel, and there's quite a few products that have kind of 0 to very little silica in them. So we're happy to kind of look at a product and say, well, that's okay. But yeah, I mean, I did a factory visit last year to a kind of worktop manufacturer, and they were fantastic. They had loads of stuff in place. They were constantly monitoring the dust levels. They had air-fed RPE. They had continuous water suppression. Everything was kind of in these big glass containers, if you like. So everything was shut off. And they said, actually, we're getting a lot more requests now for alternatives. So, the message, it is happening. The message is slowly dripping through. And I guess that's the only way that it can happen. It's not going to be a sudden change. It would be impossible to do that.
Yeah, I imagine if the actual manufacturing of that product is happening elsewhere, a lot of these businesses, the national or local businesses, really their job is the cutting and finishing and refining of those products. So they'll just be working with it's not that their business stops because that product is banned. It's just they'll have to work with safer products. They'll still need cutting and finishing and shaping, ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Might need a few more metal stainless steel presses instead. That might be the small change.
While I have you, I just want to briefly talk to you about Ultra Protect, a partner of this podcast. Look, they're not here by accident. Like the podcast, they are passionate about driving changes in our indoor environment and are an all-round great company to deal with. They have years of experience in the industry and a team of people I have leaned on many an occasion for advice and insight. From continuously tracking air quality to specific sampling, they analyse and provide actionable insights for the built environment. Specialising in dust management, they provide amazing products and services that minimise risk and improve environments from construction sites to offices to manufacturing settings, through to solutions around ventilation aimed at improving the environment in the long term. It's a company well worth checking out. There are links in the show notes and on Air Quality Matters sites, and of course at Ultra Protect UK. Now, back to the podcast.
Back on track. So I think that gives a picture of Silica, and a really interesting digression, I think, on that. I was drawing a triangle, right, when you were talking earlier, because I think in simplistic terms of hierarchies of control. And I thought I thought it might be an interesting way to frame the kind of things that manifest on site where we start to look at dust and dust control, because this is not just you reflecting on your business, but I think anybody working in the sector, there's lessons to be learned here. So I think the artificial, like you say, there's very little elimination potential on a construction site. You are grinding, drilling, shaping, moving, flattening, sanding, that dust is and the material is what it is, right? So elimination of the creation of that hazard is very difficult to do. I was trying to think what you might eliminate, other than smoking. Maybe we'll come on to that. But really what we're talking about here, and the Silica products was a good example of that, is substitution. To say, right, okay, you're going to work with a material, or you're going to do something in a particular way. Is there another way of doing this, or is there another material that we can use that reduces that risk? We may not be able to eliminate it, but is there, and the that worktop example is a beautiful example of that. Look, you want a worktop, you want it to look nice, it wants to look like white shiny marble with some sparkles in it, or whatever your design has decided is, yeah, right. What are your choices? Is there a less risky version of that? So I think that's a really good example of that. Before we get on to engineering controls, are there other kind of obvious examples of substitution on sites when it comes to dust? Are there kind of products you're identifying, or particular processes that, I suppose processes as administration controls really, but products, I suppose, primarily types of plaster, types of timber, types of paint, it's more VOCs. Do you think in those terms? Are you able to encourage people to think of the kind of materials they're using?
I'd like to think we will. I don't think we're there yet. Not sure myself on kind of particular substitute. I mean, if you think about concrete, I mean, that's everywhere. It's not something you're gonna substitute. I mean, I'm sure the contractors think in terms of wood and things like that, what might be safer, but then I guess it depends what they're having to do with it. So, but no, probably not there yet. That is a work in progress, I would say.
But the artificial work surfaces is a good example of that substitution of risk. I mean, that's a slam dunk, right? So I think that's obvious. So then we kind of move into engineering controls, right? As another. So if a process is going to create a hazard, which construction will, and the material that you're using has a hazard element to it, the first level of the next best thing you can do is remove that risk before it hits the recipient, right? And that really we're talking about engineer, and with dust, we're really talking about ventilation. The exchange of air in a space is really your only tool. I imagine filtration less so because just of the quantity. I can't imagine the amount of filters you'd have to replace on an air cleaner. So I don't know, I might be wrong.
Yeah, it's difficult. It depends, because obviously people do tasks in all different areas. It's not kind of like there's a fixed area, where you would do these tasks. If they've got to be on a part of a ceiling or part of a concrete wall or whatever, then that's where they are. And again, it depends on the task they're doing as to how much dust is created and the space as well. I mean, there's more and more, I would say in the last 2 years, I've seen more tools with on-tool extraction than I've ever seen, which is fantastic. And then we've got hoovers in terms of extraction on wood cutting stations, for example, which is brilliant again. So there are things coming in. There is more innovation, more technology than I've ever seen around this area. Even things like hoovers, brooms. I mean, if anybody knows me, I hate a broom. It's just absolutely, a nightmare.
There's a whole industry of site brooms screaming at the podcast at the moment, like going, well, what are we going to do?
I know. And to be fair, like hoovers are fairly new. I'm talking M class, H class.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. Like you say hoovers, I immediately think Henry, right? And now this is a lot
of people do. Yeah.
Right. This is a global podcast, so apologies. And I don't know how global Henry is, but the Henry Hoover, for those that don't know what it is the and anybody knows is laughing because it's immediately obvious, but basically it's a little round Hoover, usually colourful, with a black top to it, and usually it had eyes stuck on it, and it was like a face. It was like a little, they called it Henry the Hoover. And I don't know if it was really ever designed for non-domestic use, but it was such a robust tool. It's such a robust little Hoover that it's found its way into the back of, generations of plumbers' vans, chippies, electricians, It's just the go-to. If you want to buy a Hoover that you want to just tidy up at the end of the day, the Henry Hoover was a really good option. And it lasts, yeah, but it's also rubbish from a filtration and environmental protection perspective. So we when we spoke before the podcast, we were laughing about it. It's like the Henry the Hoover is like your worst nightmare when you see it on site. So there's a difference, right? That these domestic, let's just say basic Hoovers that might have a basic low grade filter to protect the fan and, stop major dust hitting back. A HEPA filter is not going to last 2 seconds on a building site. So unless it's properly designed. So these things aren't very good, are they? When you're using consumer grade products effectively on a site, they might suck up the stuff off the floor, but they're also producing clouds of very fine particles and even breaking the stuff down and making it worse in the process and just shoving it into the air.
We do ask that only M class and H class vacuums are on site, but to be fair, they are a newish technology in terms of construction. It's only been the last few years that, we've really seen them, and they're not always the greatest things you can use. And it is difficult and you kind of have to, get the best Hoover you can for the job that you got to do. But it's so much better than a broom, I mean, a broom will just sweep it up into the air. I mean, there is no kind of, I know it's quick and they're cheap and what have you. But if you're able to get a Hoover and use a Hoover, you're not having to worry too much about continuous water suppression or wearing the correct RPE or whatever it may be. So, we definitely encourage Hoovers. And I think as technology improves, the use of Hoovers will increase,
So for people that don't know, what is an M-class Hoover? Like when you're talking about this class of Hoover, how does do you know like technically what the difference between a normal Hoover is and a?
No, I presume just better filtration. I'm not sure, to be honest with you.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll do a bit of research after the podcast, and I'll put a link to something in the show notes that says, right, this is an M class Hoover, and this is why it's different.
Or H class.
Or H class. So M and H. This is why it's different. Sweeping has to happen as well. Like I'm guessing, with bits of cable and plumbing bits and small offcuts of timber and you're not hoovering everything off the floor of a space when work's been going on. So you can't, right? Yeah. So are you providing specific guidance, or is it generally understood that you should be protecting yourself? If you're sweeping, you should be masking up.
Yeah, or not that individual, but the company should be providing what they need to undertake that task appropriately. I mean, I think in the future we will basically say that no brooms are allowed unless they've been risk assessed for a particular task that cannot be done without, using the broom. I think that is potentially the direction that we will go. Because we have multiple problems with people, again, not necessarily their fault, but not using control measures, thinking, I'll just quickly sweep it up and that's it. But what they don't realise is that everyday kind of behaviours that build up, and then their exposure is increased, And I get that a lot. Just digressing a little bit with, it's just I've just got 5 holes to drill, it won't matter. But I've got 5 holes to drill every day and I never use the, correct control measures or, so it's that kind of quickly sweep up, done. And they've put a load of dust into the air or leaving piles and not clearing them up, or even down to, you're thinking about on tool extraction in regards to the Hoovers, say on the wood cutting station. Some of them, I believe the bags will automatically close when they open the lid to empty it, right? So that stops that exposure. But I have seen people kind of open up their on-tool extraction and bang the dust into the bin, the open lidded bin.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously at that point, they've taken off their RPE as well. And they bang it and it goes everywhere. So there's just these kind of little reminders, I guess, of just trying to encourage people to think about how dust works as well.
Yeah. It's really interesting it just goes to show, actually, it's a fascinating conversation because you realize that this risk is so intrinsic with every activity on a construction site, that we've spoken loads about all sorts of elements that you just wouldn't think of. So, and it's these incidental exposures. Like you say, you might have a health and safety statement for a process, and you might even have within that a process for preparing for it, right? And so, but it's that I've just got, at the end of the day, I've just got to quickly sweep up my stuff because I get told off, that if I leave a mess, and it just gets, quick dustpan and brush, just quickly sweep up where you're working, and you're down by that material. It's not like you're removed from this hazard. You are right. Your face is right in the zone, right? Like, so these are very real risks. And like you say, that's an activity, a behavior, a habit, even, and a good habit of tidying up after yourself, right? We always said you could tell the quality of a site by how clean it is. Like, it was usually one of the telltale sites when you walk around. You get a good sense of safety and quality by within, you must be the same. Within 5 minutes of landing on a site, where this site sits, right? And you go into some and they're just a clusterfuck, and you just know that it's going to be a nightmare. Others are just, everything's organized, right? But it's those incidental things, like those habitual things, like you say, that might only be 30 seconds, a couple of minutes at the end of the day. You wouldn't even think to include it in a statement or a behavior, but yet it's something you do. You probably do it as much as some people would smoke, and so every day you're exposing yourself to a level of risk of going and having a fag. And
that risk can be variable, it depends on the material. I mean, that could be general dust, for example, but it could be irritant to your respiratory system, or, not saying it's pure silica, but it depends on the task that you've been doing in terms of, what your exposure is and how long you're exposed to it and how often you repeat that habit as well. So yeah, absolutely. It's it's not also straightforward, but if you're thinking about things like, I always think of like donning and doffing your RPE, right? I'm a nurse, been a nurse for 20 years on the wards. If I was seeing a patient with an infection or whatever, and I had to don and doff PPE, then there was a little kind of separate room that you could do it in, kind of midpoint zones to do it. And you kind of understood that just being in that room, you constantly had to have on your PPE. That was just the way it was because of viruses in the air or whatever. And that person was coughing, for example. But, I think a lot of operatives, and maybe it's an education piece, it's, okay, well, I've done the task now. Off with the mask, I'm going on break. And then they'll hang it somewhere on the site. And I call these my little Christmas decorations. I go round and I see a lot of, sometimes FFP3 masks hanging up, and I just grab them and throw them away, because my concern is that they just leave them there. The dust settles in the general environment. They'll come back. Oh, there's a mask. Oh, I'm wearing a mask, and on it goes, So, yeah, I think it's just that slight education piece and reminding people and just reiterating, you've got to do this every day, because if you do the other action every day, there is a risk that you can develop these illnesses.
I mean, one of the primary engineering controls in environments is ventilation, creating zones. You just talked about a hospital and wards and clean zones and infectious zones. Like, that's well understood. If you want to manage risk in a space with air quality where there's higher hazards, that you create spaces and separation. I appreciate that's very difficult to do on a building site, but certainly you see it, in renovations, because it's a necessity. You'll see activities screened off with plastic. You'll see negative pressure ventilation systems being put in to extract the dust and make sure other zones aren't affected by it. Do you find yourself on sites where elements of that creep in to some degree, that there are activities like floor sanding or something going on where you're going to be, for a period of time, creating a particular hazard, that actually a decision can be made that we can zone this off and treat that space separately from other spaces on the site?
There has been, absolutely. There has been a couple of activities where they've completely been kind of exclusion zones and sheeting and everything's been up. I guess what I'm talking about is the little tasks, the little cuts, the little drills, the stuff that happens day to day through someone's career that, releases this dust and it's very small and tiny and you can't see it, whereas a big task that has to be done on a bigger scale is kind of built into the program, and you can make sure that things like ventilation or sheeting or whatever is needed or exclusion zones can happen. So yeah, it does happen, but on a day-to-day tasks, not really, because you just can't exclude every single area,
No. And it's an interesting one. I was kind of drawing some mental pictures, for people trying to understand how complex that would be to do. Just picture a kitchen coming towards the end of its construction phase. You will have plumbers and tilers and electricians and plasterers doing a bit of making good, and you'll have people cutting tiles. You'll have joiners doing the skirtings or finishing off units and work surfaces being done. And that's happening. They're all meshing over each other and standing over each other trying to get stuff done. There's no way that people be unzipping and zipping sheets to go in and out of that space when that's happening. It's just not going to happen. But there are ways that perhaps you could think about window opening and making sure there's air movement and cross ventilation in spaces, and those times in between activities that the ambient pollution is being dealt with as much as possible, I guess.
I think it's as well as if you are an operative about to do a task that is going to be very dusty, to kind of encourage people not to enter that area. So say if you do have at that point separate rooms, I don't know if it was a commercial project and your walls are up for your offices or whatever, and you're doing some plasterboard or whatever, it's just to encourage people, tell them, don't come into this area at the moment, that is possible. At the same time, can't restrict the program too much, so it's it is difficult. Like you say, people are working on top of each other and lots of kind of different things going on, but we do want to encourage people to warn people if they are doing something that is creating a lot of dust, so that they can go and do something else and come back later, but yeah, having kind of separate elements to it always just not.
So the way the hierarchies of control work is that, you kind of move through the most effective to the least effective, and towards the bottom of this process is PPE, right? So we can't eliminate a lot of this stuff. A lot of this stuff isn't substitutable. It's very difficult to provide engineering controls. So PPE becomes a real front line, doesn't it, for protection in these spaces. We're talking about a respiratory risk here. So I'm guessing the vast majority of the PPE we're talking about is appropriate masks for the task that you're doing. And you were talking about crappy paper masks being left hung around the place, for doing activities. And I think anybody that works in construction knows people wear these, they might be FP3 if you're lucky, but often they're not. What does that look like when you're trying to determine what the appropriate level of PPE is for processes? What are you kind of looking for with people, and what's the expectations from you as an organization with contractors and people that are coming in? How do you manage that what seems to me to be like the head of the spear, really, from your perspective as the protection mechanism?
I mean, I think when it comes to RPE, obviously we do want people to employ other control measures, but there's an element with dust, I think, where if you can't see it, I think RPE is pretty valid in most cases with other control measures, depending on what you're doing. How do we do it? I mean, the contractors need to risk assess what they're doing, basically, and decide on the minimum mask that they have in place for their operatives. That's most cases an FFP3 is the minimum. I see half masks as well with the filters, and then there are some air-fed masks or PAPR masks, powered, air-fed masks around as well. Our challenges around RPE, if we are doing a hip, for example, are they wearing it where they should be wearing it? And this is human nature, right? This is not, this is just human nature. Have they slung it on top of their hard hat? So the strap on top of the hard hat. So is it fitted properly? I've had people where it's kind of been sat like a lovely decoration on top of their hard hat, and they've just forgotten to put it on properly. Or it's sitting inside their hard hat. That's one as well, I see. So not actually on their face. Or they don't have it done up tight. Now, look, it's if you're in the middle of summer on a construction site and it is boiling hot and you're working hard, the last thing you want to do is put a mask on. Like, I totally get it. And fogs up their safety glasses, and they struggle with it, and they're on and off with it. And it's remembering that these masks don't last forever. If you go on a break, you've got to go and get a new one. You don't just stuff it in your pocket and put it on, or grab your mate's one, or whatever else. So FFP3 masks obviously have their place, but if you're talking about things like that and facial hair, it's just not appropriate.
Yeah, and that's been a big thing across sectors. Actually, is I've got a beard. A lot of people have beards and facial hair these days. It's the thing, and that presents a real challenge for fit, doesn't it?
Huge. I mean, obviously, people have facial hair for religious reasons, or they have it for personal choice reasons. And I mean, I would say 80%, if not more, of sites that I go on, a guesstimate, have facial hair or some element of stubble or facial hair. So FFP3 masks then don't have the place, and then you need to look at kind of air-fed hoods or masks, right? And they're expensive, but that is really what they need to do at a task, or they shouldn't be doing that task, right? So it's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we only have to cast our mind back to the early days of the COVID pandemic, where we suddenly asked the nation to wear masks, and the medical community was screaming out, going, this is more complicated than you think, that people fidget with masks, they don't wear them properly, they have bad habits, they don't use them, and you talking about the robing and derobing, going into infectious zones, similarly with construction risk and dust. This stuff is not straightforward to do well. So there's is there training? Do you see training on sites where there's a specific course that people go on to learn about effective respiratory protection? Is that in the marketplace yet?
Obviously, people have face fit testing. Whether they're taught how to put the mask on, I'm sure they are, but I do see a lot of people that haven't quite got it on properly. So that's something that I'm going to start exploring. Actually, it's one of my plans to kind of work out whether people are being taught how to fit a mask, and I'm sure they do, particularly with the filtered ones anyway. But it's almost like grab a paper mask, stick it on. It's good, it's cheap. You've got it on your face, so that's the kind of thought process. But unfortunately, there's a little bit more to it than that. And if we're thinking 80% of the site have facial hair, then really that's not going to do the job as much as we'd like. So
yeah, you think you'd imagine, like, because this is such a significant risk in construction, this should be something that's taught both from college level and apprenticeship level upwards. It should be a mandatory part of, in Ireland we call them safe passes. I don't know what they are in the UK anymore, but these mandatory safety courses you have to go on to be a construction worker, and you have to have a card and do them regularly. And that's where they teach you about PPE and heavy machinery and electrocution and all these things. But I can't recall masking and respiratory protection being part of that training. You should imagine it probably should be, as such a big risk for so many different operatives.
Yeah, I'm sure some people do. I'm sure some contractors do. But again, it's that whole time versus risk piece. I'm in a rush, I've got something to do, just whack it on. Or I've been told to wear a mask, so I put it on, And a lot of people wear them appropriately, but some people don't. So it's those people that we want to kind of make sure that kind of understand why they haven't, and then to encourage them to and teach them how to do it. And we'll do that on site.
There's a perceived value piece here as well. I can imagine, these throwaway products kind of exude a level of value in the sense that they're disposable, which means they're probably not that important, which means people forget about them. They, like you say, they leave them on their hat and so on. Whereas if you've actually got one of these forced air kind of respirator things, you've spent a bit of money on it. It's obvious when it's around your neck, so you don't forget that it's there, that it has a higher perceived value. And I imagine then probably people will care about the use of it more because it's a thing. Whereas a bit of paper on a bit of elastic that you kind of have strapped around your wrist or whatever it is, that you automatically, your brain is leveling the value of the product with the protection it's supposed to be giving you, are there any resistance to the breathing jobbies on site? Because they look funky if you're not used to seeing them around, but they are increasingly around. They're quite space age tech. It's not, if you don't know what it is, it's like a big plastic kind of thing with a mask, and it has filters usually at the back and a fan, and it's providing you with the fresh air you need, and it just kind of sits on your face, doesn't it, as opposed to sealed. Yeah,
they're really, I mean, I've tried them on, the clean space ones. They are lovely. I mean, if I had to wear a mask all day, I would wear that because it blows fresh air and it's very cooling and everything else. I think the kind of conversation with the contractors is that they're concerned that if they buy these kind of lovely masks for everybody, then they will disappear with the person when they move on. Construction is a very high turnover sector. People don't stay in the same job for very long, or they may be self-employed, so moving on to lots of different products. So I think that's a concern. But our kind of comeback to that is that this is just basic asset management, and it's something that we will be encouraging, and we do encourage, because ultimately people at the minute will have facial hair, whether that's for personal reasons or religious reasons, and you're not going to get everybody to shave, are you? So it's just not going to happen. So you need to kind of look at different alternatives. But yeah, they are lovely masks to wear, certainly.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few people that use them, and they really appreciate it. Once they kind of get over the fact that it's a bigger thing to wear, but they're very comfortable. They're not. It doesn't kind of get in the way of movement or whatever you want to do. But like you say, you're basically getting fresh pumped air into your face, which is probably nice anyway. Never mind. Yeah. You can well imagine at some point they become quite ubiquitous, and people that are just in those environments generally just figure out that it's worth wearing it. That the consequences of not.
Yeah, I think it's going to happen. I think that's the way technology is going. I think as more awareness spreads and more education comes out, and the more we're pressing it, and the more people are talking about it, then it will just naturally flow onto that, and they will get cheaper the more people buy them. And there's lots of different models out there on the market, isn't there? There's loads of different ones that they can choose from. But yeah, definitely the way it's going.
I mean, I know one of the issues with dust and control on buildings is the take-home potential of this risk. This isn't a risk that's just necessarily isolated to the workspace. You were talking about areas of kind of dress down in a hospital, often in a construction site, that's in the cab of the van just before they go home, taking off the coat and whatever it is they've got. And those spaces then become contaminated with dust. And we've seen this with the fire service, particularly because they often are exposed to fairly nasty pollutants. But there are new diseases hitting families that aren't genetic. They're being brought home from occupational risk, and that must exist within construction as well. Like, if people want to reason to think about this properly, it's that actually this is a risk that isn't just yours. That you need both spaces in the workplace to, if you've got protective overalls on, that they're removed in an appropriate space before you go home, and that when you go home you've also got a process for making sure you deal with contaminated clothes properly when you get home. I remember back to my early days, we'd all pile down a pub on a Friday after work, still in the clothes that we were in, and we get home, and that dust would just follow you everywhere you went. basically, and that's not a good thing. You know, there is that trope of you can't manage what you don't measure. But what's the ability in construction to be measuring these risks? I mean, you know, I know there's these dust tracks, you know, Ultra Protect do them where certain operatives will wear a device that will actually alert them to areas of high dust. Is that something you kind of think about? Is the, you know, we can provide advice and we can deploy the kind of hierarchies of control and try and reduce people's risk to it. But are you in a position to kind of quantify that risk at any level, or is that quite early days in construction? We see it in environmental monitoring, don't we, on sites that you might see stations up, but kind of personal exposure to stuff in room or on site measurement, is that something that you think about?
I mean, we do. It's very difficult because it can change very quickly, can't it, in terms of what's happening. We do, as we're the principal contractor, we use personal dust monitors on ourselves. So when we walk around and do the hits, we have kind of walked into areas, and if it alarms, we then kind of got that backup to say to the operatives in the area, look, what task are you doing? So we won't necessarily know what kind of dust it is from a machine level point of view, but we will know from what they're doing in terms of what tasks they're doing and what they're working with. And for us, that's really valuable, because if I turn around to someone and said, oh, okay, well, today you've been exposed to 0.05 silica dust, right? To an operative, that doesn't really mean anything. Right. So for us, it's invaluable to have an alarm or a light or a colour, because as a human being, when you look at that, it's a visual reference. Oh, okay, the dust levels are high, or, oh, they're okay with what I'm doing here. It just means so much more with what we're trying to do. So we do definitely use those on a regular basis.
Do they provide the data as well as the audible alarm? So can you do they data log so you can see? I think that's got to be the future, a bit like with anesthetic nurses or people working in particular environments with particular chemicals, that there's a kind of a dose limit for people, a bit like drivers with time on the road, that you have something that people that work in those environments can reliably wear, and they will tell you, not so much, I mean, like you say, the risk here is that masking in theory will protect you from that environmental risk that the sensor's picking up. But there's a background level and a degradation of that particle count that people aren't necessarily going to be paying attention to once their task is over. And like you say, particularly if it's hot and uncomfortable, they'll go, finish, you know, and the room is still absolutely soaked in invisible fine and ultrafine particles of God knows what, and they're then sitting there and having their sandwiches, or you know, or thinking about the next task or preparing for it without a mask on. And it's that's what I would worry about. You know, you can get the task level protection as good as you can, but it's that kind of ambient exposure to moderate to high levels of pollution that people aren't assessing as a risk. They're seeing that risk gone, and there's only so much you can do with training there. At some point, it'd be really interesting to be categorizing risk in those spaces.
And I know that the contractors do, if they're going to do a particular task, they will measure the dust levels in relation to that task. But like you say, it is the little bits, the leaving the area, you know, letting the dust settle before you're returning, that kind of thing that, you know, is often just not thought of as much. It's on to the next thing. You know? Business
idea for somebody really is what you want is a low cost particle monitor that in every construction space, that either up on a stand or gets screwed up to a wall, is something really robust for construction, that just has a traffic warning light system that when you enter a room to do a task, it's all ready to, you just have a look up in the corner and see, and it will tell you the level of risk in that space, and you can make then educated decisions on, that they could be as little as at scale £100 each, and they would be moved around as the site progresses and moved on. So it's not a cost, it's not a disposable cost that has to go to. Yeah, you just have one that just moves around with the activities and just gets screwed onto the wall as part of the processes, or sits on a stand in the corner. It can be moved around. It's not it's not very sensitive, but it just gives people a clue of what the level of risk is in that space. That would be awesome to see something like that you walk into a space and you go, oh, this one's in the orange. This means
right. Yeah.
Can I, is there something I can do? Can I crack a window even? Is there something I can do to get the air moving in here and drop it to green? Because I want to do some stuff that isn't dust related in here, and I don't really want to wear my mask. But at the moment, I need to wear a mask while I'm looking at drawings and preparing bits and gluing stuff together, or whatever it is you're doing. Gluing probably is a bad example. You should probably have a mask for that. But do you know what I mean? Like, I think that would be amazing. There's a product idea in it there for site. There probably is something. Somebody reach out to us on the show and tell us if you do something like that, because that would be amazing. I worry about the long-term health of construction workers, and one of the things that came out that was interesting with the talk with the fire service is it turns out that their particular career has a medical number. I can't remember what they call the cards. There's a special card that they can carry that has a code on it that describes a pattern of risk. And the theory is that's supposed to be on your medical records, or you can take it in and show a GP, and they can type this code in, and it will relate symptoms to occupation. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes to what it is. If you go back to the podcast with the fire service, we talked about it on that. And I thought that was a phenomenal idea, that you're going in to see, you start it when these symptoms of early on, because there's going to be generations of people coming through without question that are going to be acquiring chronic respiratory diseases as a result of their work, right? And the trick is to pick this up early. And often a GP and the medical community are working in the blind, and they're not joining the dots. And the idea of this code, from what I understand, is that it helps join those dots. It says, well, look, if you're seeing these symptoms, it could be related to this particular occupational risk, which I think is brilliant. So it'd be interesting to see if that would be available for construction workers as well, or particular trades, if you're working in a trade that's particularly risky.
Yeah, the high risk ones. Yeah.
How did you end up here? You were saying you were a nurse. What's been your kind of journey from nursing into walking around construction sites telling lads off for not wearing masks?
Yeah, I am still a nurse. Yeah, so
you're
that's
still
kind
a nurse.
of
Yeah, okay.
trade. Yeah, I'm still a nurse. I've been nursing for about 20 years, but started off in the NHS and moved around various medical areas, surgery, and then weirdly stepped into infection control and got an interest in, I don't know how I sidestepped this, but occupational health. The kind of more preventative side of medicine, I guess. Saw a job in London where I would be moving around construction sites and doing kind of safety critical medicals and fitness to work pieces, and talking to operatives about loads of different health issues, not just ones related to hazards, and kind of just fell into it about 9 years ago.
So was your perception kind of, I'm going to be talking about breakfast rolls and smoking predominantly? Was that's kind of,
yeah,
I'm going into health with construction, and basically this is about trying to get people off of the greasy breakfasts and to reduce the smoking.
Exactly. I remember walking on a site once, and there was 10 different fried breakfasts you could choose from, and I was like, what? Like, this is like alien to me, Yeah, the smoking piece is huge, but generally, because construction operatives, well, they're men, so tend to, there's a larger kind of male population in construction, so they tend not to kind of, I guess, talk about their health or seek the help for the health that they need. And they're very busy, and they need to be on the tools because, they need to earn the money, and, seeking help with their health is kind of last thing on the list, really.
It's funny enough, over the next few weeks, I'm doing a number of midweek podcasts, which I kind of look at papers and academic stuff, and doing a series on the psychology of air quality and risk. And it's been really interesting reading that kind of knowledge base, that how we communicate risk to people and what the triggers are for action can be so different between communities, regions, workplaces, and so on, that the messaging is so important, and finding common ground and how to speak people's language is such a powerful tool. And I'm imagining you've gone through a lot of that, having come from nursing in the medical field and on site. You've had to develop a way of talking to a 28-year-old lad who smokes and has a fry at the 10 o'clock break every day and isn't thinking about feels invincible, of communicating risk in a way that lands for them. That's fascinating, that, because I imagine there's a lot to be learned from that. If you can get success in getting people to recognize a long-term health risk like exposure to dust, there's probably a lot of lessons from that process of learning what resonated that could be applied outside of that field.
And look, I've had some real successes, and I've had people, I'm sure, that have, walked on and not paid any attention. But there's nothing I can do about that. That's just the way it is. But, I've had some real successes with people actually acknowledging, that they're quite unwell and need to seek the help, and they have, and their lives have changed because of that. And that to me is brilliant. Just sort of, basic health, not hazards in this respect. But we just have to keep banging that drum, and I think over time it will change, and I think it has. I don't think it's like it was years ago. I do think people are more aware and more educated about this topic, and do know what they need to do to look after themselves. But changing someone's health habits it can be very challenging.
Yeah, and talking of health habits, you were saying earlier on that smoking is still quite a prevalent habit on construction sites, probably more so than in society generally, that it's concentrated in construction. Yeah, that's a shame, isn't it? It's smoking and anti-smoking campaigns and things to encourage less smoking quite high up the agenda on sites generally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could always do more, I think. But, I work with Asthma and Lung UK, and they report that everybody they see, because they do some lung function testing, not from a kind of health surveillance point of view, but from a, let's see how good your lungs are type thing. And then they will refer operatives onto their GP if needed, which is brilliant. But their referral rate is about 18% in terms of who they see on site. But they reported to me that they reckon about 50% of the people that they see have said that they smoke or vape. And just my personal experience walking around sites, not that they smoke on site, but, I do see them smoking in smoking areas, and there's a lot of them. And I've seen some research say men, manual workers, and a lot of workers from Eastern Europe, where smoking is more common. But yeah, data from 28% up to about 50% I've seen in research that people still smoke. So we have in the past had smoking cessation services attend sites, and that has helped some people. And we do obviously encourage, services that are in the local area stop smoking app, even, something simple like that, that they don't need to go and attend a service, that they can do on site and get that support.
Yeah, I'd be interested if there was ways of encouraging non-smoking, incentivizing people in some way to try and stop it. Because, whatever the risks are of construction is, the thing about smoking is it doesn't seem to matter what the environmental risk is. Smoking compounds that effect every single time, it's just, so you're multiplying a risk for yourself that's unnecessary. Yeah. I was interested to hear what you said about the lung function testing, that's a great indicator, or one of the great indicators for COPD and in general. Is lung function something, is that almost like a health screening thing that's done for people, or is that just targeted for a specific reason? Because it could be a great way of picking up that with a questionnaire about some of the symptoms that people might experience, or lack of ability to do certain things that might indicate they're on the early trajectory towards CPD. If we could be picking this up early, the workplace screening would be a great place for that.
Yeah, so the Asthma and Lung UK are just literally doing they're getting more involved in construction, and they are offering to do, for a fee, they're offering to do lung function tests, and that's not part of health surveillance, which is really, I think, what we're talking about here. So health surveillance is a kind of a program of health checks, regular health checks, for people who have that exposure. So, for example, respiratory health surveillance, they will do a questionnaire. They will do a respiratory questionnaire, see if they have symptoms. They will do a lung function test, so spirometry test. And most recently, the HSE have brought out some kind of updated guidance around Silica health surveillance. I think it was 2025 they brought that out, to do with doing chest x-rays. And they've kind of recommended doing a baseline chest x-ray, which I think would be quite difficult, but a baseline chest x-ray, one after 15 years if they have a risk of exposure, and then one every 3 years. Obviously, these timings can be adjusted depending on results and things like that, which is good. I mean, it's a good thing that they're put this into what needs to be done. There is some research to show that chest x-rays don't spot 50% of early silicosis cases, for example. So, there may be some missed. They do say that you can use CT scans, which kind of would be gold standard for picking up silicosis, particularly at earlier stages. But then you have to consider the kind of radiation risk as well, and how often you do that. And I know that Dr. Joanna Feary is doing some work around health surveillance and CT scanning, and talking to various people about, potentially what could happen in future. And the only other thing with health surveillance, I think, having spoken to our contractors, is that it's a very high turnover in construction, and to kind of be able to keep up with them in terms of doing this health surveillance even every year is very difficult. And there is some confusion, I think, around what health surveillance is, because, in construction we say, well, you need to have a safety critical medical, for example, if you're doing safety critical tasks, which could be traffic marshalling, or, being a crane driver, or slinging and signalling, things like that. So you would need an extra medical on top of that, or you would need a pre-placement health questionnaire, so a fitness to work kind of check before you come in. So there's all these kind of interchangeable medicals and things like that. And I think some operatives and sometimes contractors can get a little bit confused about what is health surveillance, which is a legal requirement, and what is, your safety critical medicals and your fitness to work checks and things like that. So it's coming together, but as I say, there's still a long way to go, I think, with that topic. I mean, personally, if I had my way, then I would like to see health surveillance as a centralised. It's more of a centralised system. So what I mean by that is, if someone goes and gets a CSCS card, that's from one kind of organisation, and they carry that card with them. And could it be the same for their health surveillance and their health checks? This ongoing health screening to make sure that if we're going to pick things up, we're doing it as early as possible for operatives. So could they have a card with their health surveillance on, and then they couldn't get onto site until that they've had that health surveillance, you know?
It sounds like a fascinating area. We'll have to do more on it. If there was one thing that construction thought about that it hasn't been thinking about in 2026, what would you like to see construction doing or thinking about better than it does? What are they not talking about that they should be?
Ooh, that's a very difficult question. I think, honestly, it's just getting the basics right and making those basics a higher standard. So if we're talking about RPE, making, you know, people with facial hair, there is no other options. Do you see what I mean? Making it a mandatory standard in terms of what comes onto site, and talking about it a lot. I mean, we talk about it a lot, and I'm sure some other companies do, but just keep talking about it, and people knowing what the symptoms are and what to do and where to go if they, you know, are concerned about it or they need that help and support. I think that's just so important, but it really is just getting the basics right. And
is there somewhere they can go where they can find out what the basics are? Is there a kind of a go-to website or something that we might be able to point people to if they want to find out more information?
There's lots of kind of information around dust on the HSE website. There is loads on there about, you know, the different types of dust and what you can do to protect yourself. We've recently brought out a video on silica awareness particularly. And I know that Dr. Joanna Feary, if someone is worried about their silica exposure in terms of, you know, if they have symptoms or anything like that, and they don't have occupational health to be able to access, or their GP, then they can self-refer to her service. And the website is www.lungsatwork.org.uk. And there is a button there that people can self-refer.
Lungs at Work. Okay, we'll share the links to that in the show notes as well, because there's probably some interesting information there. It's been a fascinating conversation. Like, you know, as somebody that's been in construction, works around buildings, even just this hour and a half, 2 hour conversation has been really enlightening for me. And you realise quite how deep this rabbit hole goes, actually, when you start to think about it. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, you know, there are a whole class of people whose workplaces isn't the operational phase of a building. It's the construction and demolition. And those are workplaces too. And we don't talk about them enough. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me this morning. Thanks a million.
No, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to do so. Really good.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? Before you shoot off to whatever it is you have to do next, or even the next podcast, if you enjoyed what we've been talking about here, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. And don't forget to check out our sponsors in the show notes: Ultra Protect, Eurovent, Erico, ACO, Farmwood and Zender, all amazing companies, and without them this podcast would just simply not be possible. Check them out in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net, and do check out our YouTube channel. All this content is there, plus much more. See you again next week.